Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Adam. I am a student fellow for the Gettysburg Civil War Institute. I am a junior studying history as my major. And today I am here with Dr. Jen Murray. It is great to see you today.
Good morning, Abby. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, so today we'll be talking about Barksdale's assault. So could you please just give me a brief background on the incident, on the event,
A brief background on Barksdale's assault. Okay.
if possible?
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So this is the fight at Gettysburg on July the 2nd. And we know the Battle of Gettysburg begins by accident at 7:30 in the morning on July the 1st. And July 1, in a nutshell, is the Union Army falling back to a defensive position on Cemetery Hill. General George Gordon Meade will get the Army of the Potomac into position in the shape of a fishhook. Ultimately, 90,000 federal soldiers will be fighting at Gettysburg against the Confederate Army commanded by General Robert E. Lee along Seminary Ridge with about 70,000 men. And on July 2nd, what Robert E. Lee plans for is an offensive against both Union flanks. So he anticipates that James Longstreet, commanding the Confederate Army's First Corps, will smash into the Federal left flank, and the Confederates will attack the Union right flank over on places like Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. And those are Richard Ewell's men. So what that means for Barksdale, and I'll try my screen share now so the folks at home can see who we're talking about. What that means for Barksdale, this is William Barksdale, who commands a brigade of Mississippians, and he will be part of the Confederate attack against the Union left. Now, all this is going to be complicated unexpectedly by Dan Sickles, who commands the Union Army's Third Corps and moves forward with his corps on the afternoon of July the 2nd against Meade's orders. So Sickles and the Third Corps are holding a position that runs from Devil's Den through the wheat field into the peach orchard and then parallel along the Emmitsburg Road. Barksdale and the Mississippians are the Confederates who attack in the peach orchard. This guy is 41 years old at the time of the battle, and he's probably one of the more famous, irascible personalities at the Battle of Gettysburg. He served in the Mexican-American War. He's a politician prior to the Civil War breaking out. He serves in the U.S. House of Representatives. And then when the Civil War begins, he's appointed to command the 13th Mississippi as a colonel. And he leads his regiment into their baptism of fire at First Manassas. He's promoted then to brigadier general in August of 1861, and he commands his brigade at Antietam. They fight at Fredericksburg, and then they fight at Chancellorsville in May of 63. So at the Battle of Gettysburg, he leads 1,400 men in his brigade. And that is the 13th Mississippi, the 17th Mississippi, the 18th Mississippi, and then the 21st Mississippi. And Barksdale will be part of this big offensive, this en echelon attack that starts with a big Confederate artillery bombardment around 4 o'clock that smashes artillery fire into the Union line. And then Confederates will start stepping off from Moorfield Ridge and attacking Little Round Top. It's the 15th Alabama fight, the famous Alabama fight at Little Round Top. Then they'll attack in the Devil's Den. Then the fighting filters over into the wheat field. And Barksdale around 6 o'clock on July the 2nd, towards towards the 6 o'clock hours, getting really anxious to throw his command into the fight. And Barksdale will chat with General James Longstreet, kind of asking, he's chomping at the bit, when's it time to go in? When's it time to go in? And Barksdale will finally get the order for his men to go forward. And he leads them, if your listeners can imagine where the Mississippi Monument is on the battlefield on Seminary Ridge, he leads them from their position across those open fields up to the Emmitsburg Road, and there they start coming into contact with Sickles and the Third Corps men at the Peach Orchard. And Barksdale, the Peach Orchard, whenever I worked at Gettysburg, the Peach Orchard was always one of my favorite places to interpret. It's the part of the battlefield where you can stand in the Peach Orchard and you can see the entirety of the Union line. Right? You can see Little Round Top, you can see all of Cemetery Ridge, the heart of the Union line. And then if you look real closely on a clear, nice Gettysburg day, you can see Culp's Hill. You can see the top of the observation tower from the Peach Orchard. So you can envision that fishhook line. So the Peach Orchard's the coolest part of the battlefield to see that Union line. And it's important on July the 2nd, because Sickles' forward movement, the way his line is configured, creates a salient. And the salient is at the Peach Orchard, where the Confederates can attack the Union line from two directions. The salient is like a bulge. It's the apex in the line. And that's precisely what happens. This is Don Triani painting of Barksdale storming through the Peach Orchard. We can see him here mounted on the horse, and we can see how fierce hand-to-hand combat is playing out at the Peach Orchard. And the Federal soldiers in the Peach Orchard are Brigadier General Charles Graham's men, and he commands about 1,500 men from David Birney's division in Sickles' Corps. And with the Mississippians and then some of Kershaw's South Carolinians pressing the salient at the Peach Orchard, the Union line will collapse, and Barksdale and the Mississippians, we say, steamroll through the Peach Orchard. They steamrolled through that area, and the Union position then is quite precarious. If you cannot hold the Peach Orchard, it's going to be very difficult for Sickles to hold any other elements of his line. And the Confederates, when they break through the Peach Orchard, steamroll back, driving towards the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. And the battle there becomes quite desperate near 7:30 in the evening, as George Meade struggles to get reinforcements to hold that southern end of his defensive position, as Mississippians and some of the other Confederate units are driving towards that unoccupied area. And in the end of the day, and this is probably a longer explanation than what you envisioned, at the end of the fighting at the Peach Orchard, the Confederates capture the Peach Orchard. Barksdale and the Confederates succeed. Barksdale, of course, is going to be mortally wounded, and I suspect we'll have a chance to chat about that in a little bit more detail. But the Mississippians and the Confederates capture the Peach Orchard, and they'll hold it through the remainder of the battle. And on July the 3rd, when Pickett's charge starts, which opens with a massive artillery barrage, the signal shot is fired from the Peach Orchard at 1:07 in the afternoon. It kicks off the artillery assault in Pickett's charge. So it's key terrain on July the 2nd. It wasn't anticipated to be that way, but through some unexpected factors, namely the unauthorized forward movement of Dan Sickles and the Third Corps, the Peach Orchard becomes this really important piece of terrain that really shapes the fight on July the 2nd.
Oh, absolutely. So thank you. That was a really great explanation of the events that occurred at that time. So kind of following up on that, how do you think modern memory has changed since the assault of the assault has changed since then? What has been oversimplified or misremembered? What are some common misconceptions about the event?
That's a good question, and I'm fascinated with Gettysburg in memory, as I think a lot of us are. This is a battle more than any other battle in the Civil War that's really cloaked with myths and legends and facts, and a lot of them rooted in some degree of truth, some of them larger than life. I think with the Peach Orchard specifically, the Battle of Gettysburg gets distilled to these key moments. People will come to Gettysburg with some knowledge, probably know about Pickett's Charge, the big July the 3rd event. And if they know anything about July the 2nd, it's probably Little Round Top, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, or Jeff Daniels, right? If they've seen the movie Gettysburg, and the fight on the Federal left, Little Round Top and the Alabamians. And it's my experience, and some of this is anecdotal, but it's also from working there for 9 summers, that the Peach Orchard is overlooked or overshadowed. It was an area that not a lot of visitors come to the battlefield with information or knowledge on relative to July the 2nd. But it's such a shame because it is a critical part of the fight on July the 2nd. And, I use the expression steamrolled, the Confederates steamroll through the Peach Orchard. And maybe that's a gross generalization that doesn't do justice to the Union soldiers fighting there. And the men of the Third Corps make a fierce stand in the Peach Orchard. Graham's men make a fierce stand, some of these New York regiments, to try to hold that ground. But they're just put in an untenable position that they can't hold the Peach Orchard salient. One other kind of story or myth, and this is maybe one that's not quite so popular in America's collective consciousness, is about Barksdale and his death. And he dies, of course, on July the 3rd. And there's different accounts that say that Barksdale's wife or his nephew will come and look to exhume and claim his body to take him back down south. And they bring along his dog. And Barksdale's favorite hunting dog will accompany them from Mississippi and will lay near where Barksdale had been buried out by the Hummelball house and refused to leave. And people will say that Barksdale's dog still haunts the area of the Hummelball house. I'm sure that's a myth, right? I'm sure that's one of the myths of the Battle of Gettysburg, but that's sort of what you're driving at, I think.
Mm-hmm. Makes for some an interesting story for sure.
For sure, and everyone loves an animal story, right? I'm a dog owner myself, so that makes for a pretty popular story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what? So you've just talked about a bit about your research and your understanding of the assault so far. But what sources will you be using for your upcoming battlefield segments with the Civil War Institute?
Okay. So in normal times, this is the program where we get to walk the route. We normally would be getting on a bus at Gettysburg College, going out to the Mississippi Monument, and spending 2 or 3 hours following in the footsteps of these men. So the sources that I use start with the official records, right, to get the official reports of the Union and Confederate officers there, right? That's kind of the standard start. And then I dive into the soldiers' accounts, giving the voice to the men who fought there. And Gettysburg National Military Park Library has a really good collection of regimental histories and different regimental folders that you can dive into. The folder of the 21st Mississippi, for example, and read through soldiers' accounts of those particular regiments. So I always like to give, whether it's my students in a classroom or CWI attendees the voice and the perspective of the common soldier. So let's listen to what their experiences were like on July the 2nd. Let's listen to what they encountered here fighting in the Peach Orchard. So a lot of soldiers' accounts, and then regimental histories is another source that I would use. Different Pennsylvania units have some good regimental histories accounts, and they give us a little bit more flavor to the fight on July the 2nd. And then finally, newspapers. And this is good for learning a little more about Barksdale and what happens to him, his funeral and his burial back in Mississippi. That's covered pretty extensively in newspapers from Mississippi that provide closure to William Barksdale and his story, at least in the years following the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah. So kind of following up on the you talked about how you like to focus on the experiences of the kind of like the average soldier, what the average soldier went through
Yeah.
during the assault. So kind of following up on that, I understand that some of your battlefield segments will take place at one of the brigade's field hospitals, the Crawford Farm. And so what medical care did wounded soldiers receive?
Well, that's one of the big challenges after the Battle of Gettysburg, or any battle, right? And Civil War historians in recent years have done a great job in expanding our interpretation and understanding of what happens after the battle. Caring for the wounded, burying the dead, having relatives come to claim the bodies, what this process looks like. And that's true at Gettysburg in spades. The Battle of Gettysburg produced 51,000 casualties. This is an enormous battle in which we have to care for the wounded, you have to worry about burying the dead, and dealing with desertion and prisoners of war. So for the Confederates on that front, the men of Barksdale's brigade are going to be treated, the wounded, at the John Crawford Farm. And that's a farm that's west of the battlefield. It's out along Marsh Creek, and it's privately owned. It's Gabor Borat and his family owned this property, and this will be where Barksdale and some of the other Confederate soldiers are taken. Barksdale's men, rather. Semmes and Wofford's men are treated at the Crawford House. And that house in itself is kind of interesting. Before the Civil War, that property was owned by Basil Biggs. Not owned, rather, he was the tenant there. Basil Biggs was the tenant there, who's an African-American farmer. And he ends up Basil Biggs ends up being the tenant later on, who will be the one who's starting to cut down the copse of trees that John Batchelder comes up to him and says, no, don't cut down the copse of trees. That's so famous for the fight on July the 3rd. But the Crawford Farm is where these men will be treated for care of the wounded. Barksdale, conversely, he's going to be taken to the Hummelball House. And let me show this photo.
Mm-hmm.
There we are. This is Barksdale. So Barksdale's wounded in the assault on July the 2nd, somewhere near Plum Run. And he's wounded quite severely. He's going to have a shot that hits him in his leg, and then he's going to have a shot that hits him in the chest near the lung. And Barksdale's going to be carried off the battlefield and taken to the Hummelball property, which visitors or CWI attendees would imagine that's down along United States Avenue today. And Barksdale will die at the Hummelball property on July the 3rd, supposedly buried, at least temporarily, under a cherry tree on the Hummelball farm until his body is exhumed in the winter of 1866, 1867. It's retrieved by family members and then transported back down to Mississippi, where he's buried in January of 1867. But there's some, you're asking Abby about sources and methodology, and there's real great accounts on Barksdale. You know, Barksdale's a general who's wounded on the fight on July the 2nd, and various federal soldiers will talk about either seeing him being wounded or seeing him at the Hummelball property. And by many accounts of these federal soldiers, Barksdale was irascible to the very end. He was taken off the field. He's here in the field of the Hummelball house. It's scorching hot on July the 2nd. He's barking out orders that he wants water. There's a Union soldier who apparently is like spoon feeding Barksdale water because he's so sick. His wound is not to be gratuitous, but it's like gurgling with blood, and he's so sick and weak that he can't sit up. And there's a Union soldier who's giving him water, spoon feeding it to him. And Barksdale, by some of these accounts, is, you know, still ranting and raving, kind of irascible and fiery till the very end, when he dies of his wound on July the 3rd.
Wow, that's a very tough man for sure. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. If we have time, I wanted to share the account from the soldier who exhumed Barksdale's bullet. This is Alfred Hamilton of the 148th Pennsylvania. And he says that he attended to Barksdale, Mississippi. He was shot through the left breast from behind. The left leg was broken by 2 missiles. He was brought by some staff orderly to my temporary hospital. I gave him what I had to relieve him, which is morphine. He goes on to talk about that. He asked several times whether I considered his wound mortal. I told him I did. He desired peace, but upon terms that would recognize the Confederacy. He was a large, corpulent, refined in appearance, and his general physical and mental makeup indicated firmness, endurance, vigor, quick perception, and the ability to succeed, whether as a civilian, politician, or a warrior. And that's from the Union surgeon who extracts the bullet from Barksdale and cares for him in his final hours. So a great source that shows us caring of the wounded and how that impacted Barksdale on July the 2nd.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very detailed about how he was cared for and the effects of that, both on his like mental state and his physical state. So
Yes.
that's a really great source. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess we kind of went over this already, but for the assault survivors, what happened next? What was the aftermath that they faced now that Barksdale had died?
Well, for the men in Mississippi who survive, they have to get back to Virginia. You know, Barksdale's command, he starts off with about 1,400, 1,500 men, and he will see about 46% casualties in his brigade. These regiments will take about 46% casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. So for the men who survive July the 2nd and the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg, they have to get back to Virginia, and that's the retreat from Gettysburg. So in some ways, all the fighting and campaigning that they endured, it's not over. And when Robert E. Lee moves the Army of Northern Virginia off of Seminary Ridge and they start moving down to Maryland to get across the Potomac to get back into Virginia, that's a long and arduous process. And then, of course, Meade and the Army of the Potomac will pursue, and the campaign goes on from July the 2nd until they cross the Potomac River on July the 14th. So there's still long, miserable days ahead, and it's pouring down rain, and soldiers are tired, exhausted, without food, and without good supplies. That's true for Barksdale's men, but it's also true for the Union soldiers. Sickles, of course, is wounded on July the 2nd himself. He gets hit by an artillery shot near his headquarters at the Trossel Farm. He's carried off the battlefield, and the 3rd Corps, the men who resist Barksdale here in the Peach Orchard, they're shattered. They're decimated. The 3rd Corps, for all practical purposes, never ceases to exist again. Meade is going to have to reorganize the army of the Potomac in March of 1864, and the Third Corps and the First Corps, who also suffered so heavily at Gettysburg, will be reorganized. So those men who fight in the Peach Orchard on both sides see such heavy casualties that it really decimates their unit cohesiveness and their command structure.
Yeah, wow, that's a very tragic end for sure for both sides.
Yes,
Oh,
yes, indeed.
hmm. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. It was great hearing you talk about Barksdale's assault and the aftermath of that. And it was just great talking to you today. Thank you so much.
You bet. It's a lot to cover, but I look forward to doing our virtual tour and getting out on the battlefield and sharing the landscape and more story of Barksdale and the Third Corps for your CWI attendees. But thank you, Abby. I appreciate chatting with you today.
Yeah, it was great talking to you too.